Today, we're very happy to have Allan Hsiao from the Stanford Economics Department, who will present his very timely and policy relevant paper, The Global Effects of Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms. As I mentioned, Allan is an assistant professor of economics at Stanford University. His research focuses on environmental and development economics broadly, with a particular focus on the causes and consequences of climate change. So thank you so much, Allan, and I'm happy to hand the floor to you.
Wonderful. It's so great to be here to talk to everyone about carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This is joint work with my fantastic co-authors, Kim, Jonathan, and Catherine. So I'll just then jump into first what carbon border adjustment mechanisms are. This is a set of policies that is already currently being implemented by the European Union and sort of expanding more broadly, particularly throughout Europe. This is how it works. It's a tax mechanism that's related to the taxation of carbon. Okay, so the EU taxes carbon through the EU ETS. Let's say that it's 90 euros per ton of carbon emitted in the process of production. Now, the issue here is fundamentally a leakage issue, a demand-side leakage issue, which is that if you tax production in the EU, if you tax carbon in the EU, then now the EU consumer can simply import production from outside of the EU. And that production outside of the EU may not be subject to the same stringency of carbon tax. It isn't necessarily taxed at 90 euros per ton. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is intended to take care of that margin of leakage. And so now what happens with a CBAM, as I'll refer to it, a carbon border adjustment mechanism in place, now as EU consumers import that non-EU production into the EU, that non-EU production maybe was subject to some carbon tax, but a lower carbon tax, call it 10 euros per ton. This CBAM then is going to adjust up from the 10 up to the 90 euros as if that product had been produced in the EU. Okay, so it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism because it's taxing carbon. It's at the border because it's on imported production, and it's an adjustment because it adjusts from the lower carbon taxation outside of the EU to the as if produced in the EU level. Okay, so you get a credit for the 10, you pay 80, and then together you're adjusted up to the 90. Now, this is an exciting policy that's happening in Europe. It's important because, as we know, climate change is a collective action problem where carbon regulation is going to be borne individually by individual countries, but then the benefits of reducing a given country's carbon emissions is going to be shared globally. And so we all want to act and act together collectively because we're all sort of in the issue together. Now, when we have a collective action problem, the issue is going to be that any individual government, any individual country is not going to have quite the right incentives to fully abate, to fully reduce their carbon emissions. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is aimed at realigning these incentives. They're aimed at improving domestic competitiveness. They're aimed at reducing this carbon leakage, this emissions leakage that I just talked about. They're also aimed at encouraging carbon taxation abroad. And as I go through the talk, I'm going to quantify for you each of these margins, but I'm also going to show you in the simple stylized theory how all of these motivations are grounded in economic principles. These are all motivations that EU policymakers have explicitly mentioned, and that is going to have economic grounding that we'll talk about today. Now, there is one concern, a very salient policy concern, which is that these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, these CBAMs, because they're taxing carbon, may disadvantage lower income trading partners in particular, and therefore, in terms of global distributional effects, may not necessarily be fair. And we're going to have this kind of distributional kind of point of reference in mind as we go through our analysis today. And so what we're going to do in this paper is put together a quantitative analysis of the CBAM policies that are happening kind of in the EU, but more broadly throughout Europe. going to have a simple global equilibrium framework. And importantly, in sort of contrast to the typical quantitative trade modeling approach in at least some of the papers in that literature, I would say many of the papers in that literature, what's going to distinguish our approach is that we're really going to have the micro data at the firm level on a couple of key sectors in this space. We're going to use that micro data with a simple equilibrium framework to quantify for you the policy impacts. What we're going to do as a kind of baseline exercise is consider $100, that's about a 90 euro, European carbon tax with and without a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that with and without difference is going to isolate for us precisely the marginal impact of introducing this CBAM policy. We're going to find that that CBAM increases domestic competitiveness, increasing domestic profits for European producers by $1 billion. European producers are going to like this policy. The CBAM policy is also going to reduce leakage, reducing foreign emissions by more than 17 megatons of CO2. And so global emissions are going to go down. The CBAM is going to help improve abatement. The CBAM is also going to help to encourage foreign carbon regulation. We're going to focus on China, which is a big player in this in the markets that we're studying and that we have micro data on. And this CBAM policy is going to reduce the costs of carbon regulation for China by $1.5 billion, and therefore make carbon regulation in relative terms more interesting and less costly for the Chinese government. And lastly, in terms of incidence globally, we're actually going to find pretty similar incidence across higher income and lower income trading partners for reasons that will become clear in just a couple of slides. Connecting then back to the collective action problem, because the CBAM policy helps to bring potentially the Chinese government in by lowering the costs of Chinese regulation, the CBAM is going to facilitate a Europe-China coalition. And at that point, if China can be brought in to regulate as much as Europe regulates, the marginal abatement cost is going to fall dramatically by $30 per ton of CO2. And that helps with this collective action problem that broadly we're interested in. Okay, so in terms of the literature, we're of course building on this longstanding literature on international climate action and incomplete regulation in global markets. And in particular, we're going to be closely related to sort of papers that think about the environmental impacts of trade policy. And here, kind of echoing what I mentioned before, I'm going to draw a little bit of a contrast methodologically with a lot of the, whether it be computable general equilibrium modeling or quantitative trade modeling approaches that are more typical, I would say, in this kind of macro trade literature. Now, that approach is going to be the modal approach in this literature because it has the strength of having very rich global equilibrium effects across sectors, effects across countries, effects upstream and downstream within countries in equilibrium with rich spillover effects globally. Okay, that's going to be the strength of this approach. And that's why it's the modal approach. Where that modal approach is going to be potentially a little bit less effective and where it's going to abstract a little bit more is in connecting really to the micro data and taking advantage of firm level data, for example, that allows the kind of decomposition of the rich heterogeneous effects at play as we think about policy both locally and globally. And so there's a smaller set of papers that really lean into micro data and really lean into the heterogeneity captured by the micro data. But then these papers often will not necessarily have the rich global equilibrium effects that come only when you model things at the macro level. And we're going to sort of sit in between that. We're going to have the micro data, but we're going to layer that within and nest that within a global market for commodities with global trade that are going to allow for all of the rich policy spillovers, many of the rich policy spillovers that we're interested in.
So can I ask a quick question, Alan, just on
Go
the
ahead,
literature
go ahead.
slide? Would you mind kind of maybe talking a little bit about the empirical evidence on how big of a problem leakage really is in the EU context. Like, do we have a sense of, at least some micro estimates on, which particular industries or sectors are kind of most vulnerable?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of the best evidence here is this Koster et al. Paper, 2024. It's out as a CEPR working paper, and I've kind of put it within this global equilibrium modeling approach, but in this kind of section here. But I do want to point out that they have rich microdata as well, and they're able to show with their kind of French manufacturing firm level data the extent to which this leakage is happening and is salient, and they find pretty meaningful magnitudes. Daniel Shi and Juan Carlos Serrato also have a paper in China, also with firm level data, where sort of, a Chinese firm maybe has multiple plants, and then there's regulation on one plant, and there's essentially reshuffling of production away from that plant, but to other plants within the same firm, within the same company. And so I think the kind of firm level or plant level micro data based empirical studies do find that leakage is meaningful. And that's very consistent with the EU explicitly talking about leakage as a motivation for the CBAM policies. Wonderful. Okay, so then in terms of the timeline, to give you a little bit of background on CBAM policies within the EU, these policies were proposed in 2021. The phase-in started in 23 and will be fully implemented by 26 for the target sectors. And in this implementation period between October 2023 and January 2026, the idea is that the EU is collecting information as an EU importer imports products from abroad. They need to report on the carbon content of those imports, but they do not yet need to pay the taxes that come with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's reporting only, but by January 26, for these target sectors, the payments are intended to start. That's the EU, where the policy has been proposed and is already underway, is already being implemented. And let me just also take a moment to really stress the kind of path-breaking nature of this policy. It is something that, comes out of the economics literature, made its way into the policy discourse, actually got implemented, actually is starting to have bite in these sectors. The Chinese government, for example, has expanded Chinese carbon regulation to include these sectors being targeted by the EU CBAM, actually mentioning the EU CBAM policy as a motivation for that carbon regulation in China. So this is a policy that is ambitious, it has bite, and I would say is the most large-scale kind of ambitious green trade policy that is actually being put in practice today. So I sort of want to emphasize that. This is path-breaking policy that we're interested in here. And to the EU's great credit, they've really kind of been leaders here. Okay, so that's the EU. This CBAM policy is also kind of having impact throughout Europe. The UK and Norway are targeting 2027 for the implementation of a parallel CBAM policy. The EFTA is subject to the EU ETS, and so it's exempt from the CBAM policy, but there are other countries that aren't in the EU but are within Europe that are sort of in the mix as well. And I mentioned Chinese policy, but there's also discussion in Australia, Brazil, Canada, Taiwan, and elsewhere. The CBAM policy and these sets of policies are starting to take off. Now, for the EU policy in particular, there are 6 initial target sectors. And the reason they're starting with these target sectors, you'll notice these products, aluminum, steel, fertilizer, electricity, cement, hydrogen, are all sort of homogeneous kind of raw materials where it's kind of easier to trace. One doesn't need to think about 8 layers of a value added or carbon emission value added chain where the product is transformed through many phases. these kind of raw products are sort of easier logistically to keep track of. And so it's no surprise that this is where the EU is starting. But agriculture, for example, is a highly emitting and also highly traded sector. And it's not difficult to imagine that there's going to be expansion beyond these initial target sectors in time. Now, these are these 6 sectors. We are focusing on aluminum and steel because these 2 sectors are both highly traded. 41% of produced aluminum is traded outside of its country of production, 23% for steel. And these are also highly emitting sectors. They're a relatively large proportion of global emissions. Fertilizer, for example, is highly traded, but not such a big proportion of global emissions. Electricity is a huge proportion of global emissions, but not so highly traded. The carbon border adjustment policy is binding for products that are both highly emitting and highly traded. Why? Because it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's targeting carbon. You are most binding for high emissions, and it's at the border. Okay, and so it's binding on products that are highly traded. So aluminum and steel are kind of in that sweet spot, and that's where we're going to focus our data collection efforts. Both of these products are involved kind of smelting and milling and are therefore very carbon intensive. So that brings me directly then to the data. For aluminum and steel, we're going to have the near universe of kind of micro data at the plant level. We're going to focus on data from 2023. Data on the aluminum smelters come from WoodMac, steel mills come from Climate Trace. We have something like 1,050 worldwide between the 2 of them. And both of these data sets, for WoodMac, for example, they're going to combine public data, but also a little bit more. They're actually going to visit particular sites to kind of measure the data. For Climate Trace, they're also going to benefit from the mill level data, but also kind of satellite data that allow them to measure heat signatures and quantify production and emissions in that way. What do we see in the data? We're going to see production, we're going to see capacity, but we're also going to know the cost structure of the costs of production. That's going to help for estimation in a way that you'll see in just a bit. And importantly, we're also going to see the emissions and therefore the emissions intensity. And therefore, through the microdata, we're going to see the heterogeneous emissions, which are going to lead to heterogeneous incidence of carbon policy in a way that we're going to be able to actually measure in the data. And then we're also going to benefit from having hand collected at the subnational level carbon taxation and allowances that are going to allow us to kind of account for existing policies on the ground. With the production cost data and the capacity data, we can plot production costs by cumulative capacity, just lining the plants up in both aluminum and steel by their costs of production that we see in the data. And what we end up with are cost curves that kind of give us a sense, sort of if you needed to expand the amount of production from 50 up to 100, what the kind of cumulative production cost structure would look like as you expand from lower cost plants to higher cost plants. That's what these sort of plant level data are going to give us. Now, these are cost curves, and therefore we're going to need to do a little bit of modeling to go from a cost curve to a supply curve. And that's sort of the point of the supply model that I will show you in just a bit. In terms of quantities, we're talking about China being really a major player in this market for both aluminum and steel. China produces more than half of the world's aluminum and more than half of the world's steel. Europe, however, is in there. Europe is in the mix. Almost 10% of steel production is European, 5% for aluminum. And so that's the sense in which European regulation is meaningful, does have a meaningful impact on global carbon emissions, but also is potentially subject to leakage because Chinese production, if it's less taxed than European production in terms of a carbon tax, can expand in response to what the EU is doing. And that's where that carbon leakage concern comes in. Now, just from the data, I can show you some descriptive facts here, some stylized facts. The first thing to note is that carbon pricing is going to shift the competitive landscape, and this is how you can see it. First, let's think about high cost versus low cost plants. If carbon is not priced, then those costs determine cost competitiveness. The high cost plants are less competitive because they can't make much in terms of profits, their costs are high. The low cost plants to the left here are more competitive because even for a low price, they can make a profit. And what we can see here is when we plot emissions intensity against this production costs, which is the traditional margin of competitiveness, the relationship is pretty flat. That is to say that both traditionally uncompetitive plants and traditionally competitive low-cost plants, both of them have both high emission and low emission plants within them. It's not the case that every traditionally competitive plant is going to be low emissions and therefore still be competitive once we start pricing carbon. That is to say that once we start pricing carbon, and now competitiveness is both a function of production costs and emissions intensity, who is going to be competitive and who is not going to be competitive is really going to start shifting around in a meaningful way. And so the data are going to inform that incidence of regulation, and that's what we're going to be interested in this paper. The second thing is that there's a lot of heterogeneity here focusing on emissions intensity, high emission versus low emission plants per ton of production. There's variation across countries, okay, but there's also a lot of variation within countries. For aluminum, if you run a regression on a country fixed effect, the country fixed effect only accounts for 48% of the variation in emissions intensity that we see at the plant level. Within countries, there's just as much variation as there is across countries, even more so for steel plants. And this is the sense in which having that plant level data, rather than in the typical quantitative trade modeling empirical approach where you say all Chinese plants have X emissions per ton, or all American plants have Y emissions per ton. Our plant level data are going to allow us to measure heterogeneity that is meaningful and potentially important. Now, turning to incidence then, across higher income and lower income countries, the data show us something else that we found to be surprising, actually. The prior, I think, in the policy discussion, whereby CBAM policies potentially have the concern of kind of disproportionately impacting lower income countries, the prior underpinning that concern is that producers in lower income countries are especially intensive in their emissions, intensive in how many tons of carbon they emit per ton of aluminum or steel produced. And what you see here in these bin scatter plots that plot this emissions intensity versus kind of GDP per capita, what you see here is a very flat relationship, and this surprised us. That is to say, both in rich countries and in poor countries, both in higher income and lower income countries, you have both emissions intensive, high emission intensity production, and low emission intensity production. Just by knowing whether a producer is in a higher income country or a lower income country, you can't actually say immediately whether they emit a lot or a little. Of course, particular countries are going to be more emissions intensive or less emissions intensive, and we're going to be able to speak to that because we observe the emissions intensity at the plant level. But it's not the case that there's a steep gradient here in terms of emissions intensity by income. And as we dig into this, there are a few things we can say. So first off, you may think that higher income country production and lower income country production is just different in its composition, in whether it is producing direct kind of primary production or if it's doing secondary recycled production. Recycling is less emissions intensive than direct primary production of the material without recycling it. maybe the scale of production is different, maybe state ownership is different, maybe foreign ownership is different, maybe the age of the plants is different. Now, we observe all of these covariates in our microdata, and it turns out that even once you control for these differences, these compositional differences in production, which do have an effect, this positive effect here says that if you recycle, it's less emissions intensive, of course. But even controlling for those compositional differences in production, you still see these small in magnitude and not statistically significant slopes. You still see this flat gradient. Now for aluminum, aluminum emissions basically come from electricity. Okay, electricity is by far the biggest emissions intensive input into aluminum production. And what we can see is that the emissions intensity of electricity across different grids, across different countries is also kind of flat. And that's what explains the flatness in aluminum production. From these 4 data sets that collect electricity grid emissions intensity per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour across different countries globally, we can kind of take those emissions intensities, we can pool the data together and then have a kind of data source fixed effect. And we still see this, now it's weakly statistically significant, but note that it's quite small in magnitude, the slope. This is log. So this says that 1% increase in GDP per capita corresponds to only a 0.1% increase in emissions intensity of production. So it turns out electricity emissions are fairly flat with respect to income. Electricity is most of aluminum production's carbon emissions. And so the flatness here kind of explains what's happening for the flatness that we see in aluminum. Now for steel, it's different. For steel, electricity is part of the carbon emissions, but not 90%. For steel, what's happening is a little different in that it turns out that the emissions intensity for steel, and this should say aluminum, not top producers. This is a mistake. And then this should say steel over here. Okay. The emissions intensity is just more compressed for steel than it is for aluminum. For aluminum, the most emissions intensive producer is emitting 15.2 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum produced. That's about double the world average. For steel, the technology of production is just older and more kind of consistent throughout the world. There's a certain kind of homogeneous way of doing things, and that shows up in the emissions intensity. The most emissions intensive producer of steel, the most emissions intensive producing country for steel, only has about 30% higher emissions intensity than the world average. And so steel emissions are just more compressed globally. It's a more homogeneous technology of production. And that's going to help explain that flatness that we see for steel. So those are the stylized facts. And from there, we can move to the model. For the purposes of this talk, because it's a short talk, I'm not going to dwell on the details of the model, and I'll go through a bit quickly to make sure we have time to talk about the policy simulations at the end. Okay, so for the model, where I do want to spend just a few minutes is on the theoretical underpinnings of what we're talking about here when we talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So let's think about a world with environmental regulation in a regulated market R. There's going to be a carbon tax in the regulated market R, but there's also an unregulated market U that has no taxation. And this is a world with global trade. And that global trade is going to give rise to the rich equilibrium effects that I've been talking about from the beginning, where policy action in one place impacts outcomes in all places globally in equilibrium through the world price. And that world price is going to be that equilibrium object that's going to give rise to these global equilibrium forces. So here, the world market is going to clear at a single world price P. The law of one price is going to hold in this very simple model with no CBAM. Let's start with no CBAM so that we can see what is happening here. So as the EU policymakers think about putting in a CBAM, this is the concern. Okay? The concern is that EU or regulated market taxation, regulation, is going to disadvantage firms in the regulated market because they have to pay the carbon tax. That's adding to their costs. The firms in the unregulated market aren't paying anything. And so in relative terms, now the regulated firms are becoming less competitive. The carbon tax is hurting them. There's also going to be leakage in equilibrium through the equilibrium world price. This is the sense in which policy in the regulated market impacts outcomes everywhere globally. Why? Because as the regulated market taxes carbon with tau, they're going to reduce the supply that the regulated market is putting out. That's going to reduce the supply globally. That's going to, in equilibrium here, push up the global price. And now the unregulated firms in the unregulated market see a higher world price. Their profits are going up from production, so they want to expand production. And as they expand production, their emissions are going to go up. Okay, so even as emissions go down in the regulated market, emissions go up in response in the unregulated market. That is the leakage concern. There's also going to be an incentives issue here. This is the collective action issue, whereby the unregulated government can now free ride on the sacrifices that the regulated market is making because emissions are going down globally and the unregulated government benefits from those lower global emissions. So competitiveness, leakage, incentives, all of those can come directly from the theory. But if we're going to talk about incidence and kind of higher income countries versus lower income countries, bigger firms, smaller firms, all of that is going to depend on the firm data. So I just want to make clear sort of what is coming from the model here and what really you need the data to be able to speak to. For incidence, you need the data. Okay, so that's with no carbon border adjustment mechanism. What is the CBAM doing in the simplest possible boiled down stylized model here? The CBAM is giving rise to equilibrium reallocation, and we're going to see all of the benefits in terms of competitiveness, leakage, and incentives just from the simple model. So what's going to happen is the CBAM is effectively going to strengthen regulation even more in the regulated market. And now firms in the unregulated market, instead of selling to the regulated market, are going to push the sales elsewhere. They're going to reallocate the sales elsewhere. And that's going to bid down the price in the unregulated market, which has now a bigger supply. But as those sales get diverted away from the regulated market towards the unregulated market, the regulated market now has lower supply, and so the price is going to go up in equilibrium because we have equilibrium prices. Okay, so the key thing here is that the firms are choosing who to sell to, which market to sell to. The regulated firms are going to choose to sell in the regulated market because the prices are going to be higher there, and they have to pay the tax no matter what. The unregulated firms are going to choose subject to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. If they sell to the unregulated market, they get PU, and PU is lower. Okay, so maybe they want to sell to the regulated market because PR is higher. The regulated price is higher, but if they sell to the regulated market, they have to pay the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is the same as if they had been producing in the EU. Okay, and so if they're a clean producer, they're going to want to chase the higher price. But if they aren't a clean producer, if they have high emissions, this tax is going to be too high and they're going to be pushed away. And now the law of one price doesn't hold anymore. We're going to have a regulated price and an unregulated price. And so all of the economics come through this. Okay, all of the economics come through the reallocation of trade as unregulated firms now are discouraged from selling to the regulated market because now they have to pay the carbon border adjustment mechanism tax. And they reallocate away from the regulated market to the unregulated market. The competitiveness motivation that the EU policymakers have mentioned is here. Okay, where's the competitiveness issue? Well, when there's this carbon taxation tau combined with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, that CBAM is going to increase the stringency of the tax. It's going to push supply out of the regulated market. And so now the price in the regulated market is going to go up because the supply in the regulated market has gone down. I can say the intuition for this price action in another way, which is that the carbon border adjustment mechanism policy what is it? It's the regulated market, the EU, expressing a preference for low emission products. It's expressing a green preference. You have to pay for that extra preference because not every product is green. And so if you want to pick and choose the green products, the supply is low, the price you have to pay is higher. You have to pay a premium for that. But in equilibrium, what that's going to do is it's going to raise the price in the regulated market. And so now the regulated firms, look, they have to deal with the regulation of the carbon tax. That's going to hurt their competitiveness, but their price has gone up. And so their profits are going to go up. And so now the CBAM policy is going to increase their competitiveness. It's going to increase their profits. The leakage bit is also going to be helped here. Why? Because with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's pushing sales out of the regulated market to the unregulated market. It's putting downward pressure on PU, on the unregulated price. That's dampening the incentive for unregulated firms to increase their production, and that's the source of leakage. And so leakage now is going to be lessened, again, because of this equilibrium reallocation of trade. And then lastly, the incentives are also going to be there because it's an adjustment mechanism. If I'm taxing at 10 euros per ton outside of the EU, when my firms export to the EU, they get credit for the 10. Now they only pay 80 to get up to 90. They don't have to pay the full 90. And so now the government in the unregulated market can tax all the way up to the tax in the regulated market, and the firms get credit for it. That is to say, those firms are paying 90 regardless. But if I tax at home in the unregulated market, I get to collect the tax revenue. Otherwise, the tax revenue is going to the EU. And that's going to give me an incentive as the unregulated government to tax here. So in terms of competitiveness, leakage, and incentives, all of that is going to come through from the theory. But the incidence, again, higher income versus lower income, that depends squarely on the firm data, the micro data, which we, okay, so again, what the model is giving us and what the data are giving us. Okay, I'm going to be especially quick here on the empirical model. We're going to have demand curves that we estimate. There's going to be a demand by market. There's going to be a price that's endogenous. So we're going to have an instrument for it, whatever. I'm going to skip the details, but we're going to have demand curves by market. We're going to have demand elasticities somewhere in the 0.93 range. So not super, super elastic, but also not zero either. On the supply side, we're going to benefit directly from our plant level data. We're going to have a logit model of production where you're choosing whether to operate individual lines out of the capacity that you have. And so you're basically choosing how much of your capacity to utilize. The higher the profits, the more of the capacity gets utilized, and higher utilization of capacity is going to correspond to higher production. The way to think about this is that it's going to be kind of small plants. We do have 1,000+ plants in the data, okay, but that means, so it's not too crazy to abstract away from market power, but I just want to highlight, we're not going to have market power here. That's going to keep the modeling and estimation simple. The other important thing that I want to note is that we're keeping things simple by having this be pretty static. Okay, so we're not going to capture if regulation gets ramped up very quickly. Now I have no incentive to invest in capacity over the long run, and so I'm going to let my plant fall off and go out of business in 30 years once I kind of run down my capital. Okay, we're not going to have that. When you introduce those dynamics, things are going to be much, much more complicated. We're going to keep things simple and try to stay as close to the micro data as we can. So we're going to have the kind of logit style estimation that we're going to estimate directly on our micro data. And what I want to highlight here are two things that the micro data buy us. Okay, the micro data simplify our lives and make things nice and tractable in two important ways. The first thing is that the micro data give us costs, and we're going to treat those costs as data and as part of the cost structure of the industry. Rather than needing to estimate the full set of cost parameters, we see the costs already. So the only thing we need to estimate is the single parameter that is the supply semi-elasticity technically. Okay, how do firms respond when their profits go up, how much more does their production go up? If supply is very elastic, then as profits go up, why do profits go up? Either because costs are low, or prices are high, or regulation is low, and we're going to play around with that regulation in equilibrium. Okay? But we want to know how elastic supply is. We need to estimate that, but we don't need to estimate the entire set of cost parameters. So the cost data are going to simplify our lives in that way. The other thing is that the cost data are going to help us to deal with endogeneity. Prices are endogenous, but we're going to be able to, because we have within country data, look at production within country, and within a country, the price is the same price. So we're going to be able to get rid of that via the fixed effect. Also, costs may themselves be endogenous. They may be correlated with unobserved technology at the firm level, but with our rich set of microdata, we're going to have a rich set of observables at the plant level, and we're basically going to be able to match on those observable. And so we're going to be able to compare plants that are similar in terms of their age, their state and foreign ownership, their scale of production, and we're going to use similar plants as counterfactuals for similar plants. We're going to compare like to like. We couldn't do that if we didn't have the microdata. Okay, the last thing that I'll just mention briefly on this empirical implementation is we are estimating things. We're not calibrating things. And so that's going to also be a distinction that the microdata are going to buy us from the typical approach in this quantitative equilibrium, quantitative trade modeling approach, where typically the model is calibrated and not estimated. We're actually estimating things, and we're able to talk about endogeneity issues. Okay, and then we're going to get supply elasticities. Supply is relatively inelastic, but it's still going to respond to regulation. Okay, so these are, with 5 or so minutes left, this is what we can do once we have the model up and running. We can simulate a European carbon tax at $100 per ton of CO2. We can pair it with a CBAM or not, and the difference is going to isolate for us the marginal impact of the CBAM. And then we can evaluate welfare for consumers, for producers, in terms of government revenue, relative to a world with zero regulation. Let's call it business as usual. And we're going to be able to decompose that welfare for Europe, which is going to be regulated, for China, which is unregulated at first, but we're going to entertain Chinese regulation and think about impacts for China, and for the rest of the world. So this is what we get. First, I want to show you the price effects. These are the equilibrium objects in the model. This is why it's an equilibrium model. This is why regulation in one place impacts all markets globally. It's through the equilibrium price, through global trade. With no carbon border adjustment mechanism, the law of one price holds. Prices go up because regulation increases the cost of production. Supply goes down, prices go up everywhere. With a carbon border adjustment mechanism, there's also going to be, on top of that regulation effect, reallocation happening as unregulated firms get pushed out of the regulated market and redirect sales to the unregulated market. And that higher supply in the unregulated market is putting downward pressure on prices in the unregulated market. They're going to go up, but by less. Instead of 0.41%, they're only going to go up by 0.33%. But Europe has to pay a lot for this green preference that they're expressing via the EU CBAM policy. Prices are going to go up by more than 1% rather than 0.41%. These magnitudes are not huge just because Europe is small. Recall that it's only producing between 5 and 10% of production. But those price effects are going to translate into boosted competitiveness. With no carbon border adjustment mechanism, European producers are losing $23 billion in profits in producer surplus. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, because it's pushing those European prices up, are dampening how much the European producers are losing from regulation. And so in relative terms, they're gaining $1 billion. The regulation is $1 billion with the CBAM, less painful for European producers. Of course, European producers still don't necessarily like the regulation, even with the CBAM, right? Because they're losing out, they're bearing the costs of regulation. But it's $1 billion more palatable for the European producer, but at cost to producers elsewhere. Prices elsewhere went up by less. And so the extent to which foreign unregulated producers are benefiting goes down from 4 to 3 in China, from 3 to 2 in the rest of the world. The CBAM is helping European producers at cost to non-European producers. The leakage effect is also happening here, okay? Without a CBAM, let's just focus on China, for example. The prices went up for Chinese producers. They're going to, in response to that European regulation, they're going to produce more, but prices go up by less, so they produce less. And so then the relative rise in emissions falls, and the CBAM therefore is reducing global emissions, okay? Going down by 18 instead of 17. The CBAM is also going to encourage Chinese regulation. Chinese producers are going to suffer if China joins in regulation with the EU at $100 per ton. But with the CBAM, Chinese welfare is going down only by, at the aggregate level, 18 billion instead of 19 billion. So $1.5 billion less painful for China. And what that's going to do, in effect, is reduce the average costs of abatement that China is dealing with in reducing carbon emissions globally, going down from 61 with no CBAM down to less than 58 with a CBAM. Okay, so I'm just going to rush through in the last 2 minutes the remaining slides to give you the high level takeaways. Abatement, if China joins Europe, is much, much higher because China is such a big part of the global market. But that abatement is cheaper with a CBAM. With the CBAM, the solid line is always below the dotted line. The CBAM is reducing leakage, and so it's making carbon abatement more efficient, and therefore it's lowering the costs for the world to reduce carbon emissions. I'm going to close out then with incidence. Because emissions intensity is flat by income, it turns out that both consumer surplus and producer surplus losses actually are also relatively flat by income level. But for particular countries, India, for example, as a producer, India is a relatively lower income country. Just because not every lower income country is high emission or low emission, fine, but India does happen to be a lower income country that is relatively high emission intensive in steel production in particular. Indian producers are losing out by quite a bit from this CBAM policy. Okay, but Indian consumers are gaining. Indian consumers like the lower prices that the CBAM puts in. We ran other counterfactuals, but let me just close out. This is a quantitative equilibrium analysis of European CBAM policies, which help to boost competitiveness, curb leakage, encourage foreign regulation. And it turns out without disproportionate impacts on lower income countries. And we think that the domestic advantages here for European producers in particular help to, one, establish carbon regulation in the first place, but also two, help to sustain international coordination by lessening the impacts on countries that take that first step and regulate carbon. This is an easy way to reduce the costs for them. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alan. So I'm going to ask one question and then I'll turn it over to a few people in the audience. So my one question is, this is really very interesting, but it's kind of, the conclusion maybe comes from the fact that it seems like a lot of emerging markets have lower emissions intensity than we may have thought in these sectors. And also many of them also already have some type of a carbon price. And I was wondering, two things. The first is if there's a dynamic component where richer countries have an advantage in investment and they can invest in abatement, some of those kind of signs might flip and we may end up seeing emissions intensities going in a different direction. So how do you kind of think about I know it's a static model and you kind of mentioned that at the beginning, but how are you kind of thinking about that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, perfect. No, this is very much where our minds are. Let me say a few things. So the kind of neutral effect that we find globally across income levels, it's actually not coming from existing carbon regulation. That turns out to be pretty minimal, even in richer countries, because they have a lot of allowances currently, especially when we account for those allowances. The carbon regulation isn't even quite as high as one might think. So it really is driven by producers in the data in lower income countries just not being quite as emissions intensive as at least we had expected when we looked at the data. Now, let me also qualify that statement a little bit because that's for aluminum and steel.
Yes, right.
And so, I have the data on aluminum and steel. I don't want to make the claim across every single other sector. The dynamic component and this kind of green investment is very interesting. In the paper, I skipped over it, but we do have a set of counterfactuals to help us to think about that. So we think about counterfactual impacts when firms can invest in abatement technology. And what I think is interesting to hint at the dynamics is this green expansion counterfactual, where we say, look, all of the steel and aluminum plants that already are in existence now, that's sunk. Okay, so they have their capacity, they have their emissions intensity. Let's keep that fixed. But let's talk about the industry, aluminum and steel combined, growing 30 to 50%, as is projected by industry reports, over the next 70 years. And let's talk about what happens if all of the new plants that come into being between 2025 and 2100 or 2070 or 2050 can respond to CBAM policy, which bids up the price of clean production. And let's talk about what happens if they can respond by cutting their emissions in direct response to that CBAM achieved green premium. And we talk about the kind of emissions implications of that. What we haven't done, which you mentioned, which I think would be really interesting, is if we had a twist on that, which is to say, let's allow maybe producers in higher income countries to be a bit more responsive than producers in lower income countries, and how would that change the distributional impacts? That's something that's very doable within our framework that we should try. Yeah.
Sounds great. Awesome. So we have a lot of questions. 2 people had emailed me in advance, so I'm going to do those 2 first. So Thea, why don't you go ahead and ask your question to Allan?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, congrats on this super interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I was wondering the following. So this regulation that you look at, the CBAM, is still in a reporting phase, and so no major outsiders have yet internalized the costs and aligned their climate policies. And so one plausible reason could be that the structural incentives that it creates, for example, driven by the market size, the export dependence, and policy credibility, but they're not yet strong enough to outweigh domestic political cost of adopting carbon pricing abroad. Now, I was wondering what we learn more generally about the structural features of border-adjusted carbon policies or policies in general to make them capable of scaling global climate coalitions and international cooperation and coordination. And I know that your paper touches upon this topic in several sections, but my question is whether you could model this threshold conditions under which this CBAM-induced trade and competitiveness effects become large enough to foster international cooperation and to outweigh the political costs on the other side.
Absolutely. I mean, so there are a few very interesting threads here. Let me touch quickly first on this reporting phase bit, which I think also came up in the chat. So indeed, right now, a European importing firm just needs to report the carbon content of their imports, but they don't actually need to pay the carbon border adjustment tax yet, but they are obliged to report. Now, if firms are dynamic and they are thinking forward to what supply chains are going to look like in 5 years under a world where the CBAM is in place and is binding, then in principle, they should start already trying to adjust their supply chains to deal with that. You could have a green paradox thing whereby now actually they just increase their emissions to get as much in from the cheaper foreign producers now before the policy is actually binding. So the dynamics could cut in both ways. But that's the sense in which a kind of fully dynamic model would really be able to pin those elements down. We definitely don't quite have that. But the EU is implementing the tax by 2026. This is kind of as good as it gets in terms of green trade policy. But it also, related to your other question, is going to, in some sense, limit a little bit the scope of the exercise for this particular paper. One thing I can just kind of clarify here is that this paper is very much ex-ante policy analysis. It's not ex post. The CBAM isn't binding yet. And so we can't evaluate in the data what happened after relative to before. It's all before right now. And so through the equilibrium model and with the microdata, we're attempting to kind of simulate out what the impacts might be once the tax becomes binding. And we do think that's useful in the sense of, let's inform policymakers before the thing actually happens to be able to give them a sense of what the impacts might be. Now, because it's ex-ante policy analysis that is going to rely on our particular model, we always have this kind of trade-off between how much you model and how much you don't model. And so I completely agree with you that the really interesting question here is what the set of CBAM policies will do for international coordination and an international coalition. And one could imagine a game theoretic model of coalition, collective action, whereby there's no profitable unilateral deviation and kind of a stable coalition. That's going to require a lot more modeling than what we currently have. But I will also say, and you hinted at this, where our paper does touch on this quite a bit. What we have is not quite, we stopped short of the game theoretic model of coalition formation, but our framework does allow us to quantify all of the payoffs, right? What is the incentive to unilaterally deviate? How much does a particular government lose in consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue if they act versus do not act in isolation unilaterally? We can quantify all of that. So in a sense, we can deliver you the payoff table to think about the Nash equilibrium of policy setting. But we didn't go to the step of kind of actually modeling that policy setting, because then that would be nested within our already relatively rich model if we wanted to run counterfactuals all the way to that level. We see this as a first step.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this is a super interesting trajectory to going forward.
Great. Thanks, Thea. Okay, so Carolyn sent 3 questions. Carolyn, pick one and ask your favorite question to Allan.
Will do. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation and also enjoyed reading your paper. So, so I think I will pick my question on global welfare. So, and especially I think also when you summarize, right, and in the discussion of your paper, you explicitly refer to lower income trading partners, lower income countries. So I'm just wondering about the weighting that you do in when you think about global welfare. Would it be relevant to consider a different kind of weighting scheme or some kind of distributional weighting or yeah, that's
Oh, absolutely. We should do that. That's my short answer. Your intuition's exactly right. When we talk about global welfare just in words, we do have the distributional impacts across countries in mind. But when we talk about global welfare effects in the tables and the particular numbers that we calculate, we're weighting every country equally. And so one could certainly play around with the weights by GDP as a function of GDP per capita, for example. The one thing to highlight is that here we see that the impacts are relatively flat by income. So I think actually if we change around the weights, given that the impacts are relatively flat, it may not change the actual numbers too much. But again, and that's why we kind of also have the country specific numbers here. What I don't want to get lost is sort of, if you tell me a country is lower income, I can't really tell you whether they're high emission or low emission. So I can't really tell you if they're going to be impacted very negatively or even a little bit positively by the European CBAM policy. But particular countries like India, for example, they're a kind of relatively lower income. And we do know in the data that they are high emission intensity. And so, of course, there are going to be particular countries, including big, important countries like India, that are negatively impacted. And so the two things are happening sort of at once. It's flat on average, but not for particular important countries in the world. And so we do want to be a bit clear on that.
No, that's great.
Thank you. So Allan, we have a lot of questions. I wanted to ask you kind of about your availability, maybe to take one more question, and then maybe we can ask others to maybe follow
I don't have anything that. Awesome.
Okay, excellent. So why don't we go with Thomas, and then Christopher, someone asked 20 questions in the Q&A. Maynard Clark, After Thomas, I'm going to ask you to pick one of your questions to ask Allan. So why don't you go ahead, Thomas Borani?
I think they cannot ask a question. They cannot unmute themselves.
Okay, I see. So then, I see. Okay, okay. I don't know how to do that. He put it in the Q&A, so I'll just read it out. He had two clarification questions. The first is the bilateral trade flows are not determined in that model, right? And then he asked, what about trade costs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Thomas, for the questions. Thank you also for tuning in. Yeah, there are no bilateral trade costs. There are no trade costs, and the bilateral trade flows are not modeled. And so what that means is that I'm not going to flip back and forth. That just makes the market clearing condition super simple. And so it's very, very fast to solve. We are going to still capture the important equilibrium force of unregulated producers in response to the CBAM, making the regulated market exporting less attractive. They're going to shift sales away from the regulated market to the unregulated market. So we're going to model that trade reallocation explicitly, but it's going to be sort of at the regulated versus unregulated market level. And so you can think about all the bilateral stuff being collapsed into a two-market situation. Regulated sells to regulated or unregulated. Unregulated firms sell either to regulated consumers or unregulated consumers. That's the extent to which we are bilateral, but we do capture that at least, but with no trade costs. Trade costs, by the way, if they're fixed and held fixed in counterfactuals, are not at all a problem. Conceptually, it's just an extra residual that we need to stick into estimation, but it would be calibrated. And so we kind of like that we can say everything is estimated here.
Great, thanks for clarifying. So I picked, Maynard told me to pick a question, so I picked my favorite of his question. It's a political economy question. So he asks, if tariffs are repurposed to support environmental goals, how do we ensure that political will remains anchored in climate outcomes rather than in protectionist populism or sort of election-driven optics and like industrial policy? So outside your paper, but would love your thoughts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, sure. I think I may end up taking this answer in a slightly different direction from what Maynard had in mind, but I do think that the political economy, this is a time to be thinking about political economy. This is a time to be thinking about the political economy of trade policy. This is a time when I think green trade policy, like the EU CBAM, has the opportunity to have some impact. Why? Because the CBAM policy is a policy that helps the domestic implementing country. It gives rise to domestic advantages. It helps domestic producers who otherwise would want to lobby against any kind of green policy. It reduces leakage and therefore increases the benefits globally, but also then translates into higher domestic benefits for that kind of implementing government. It's a policy that brings foreign governments in to make sacrifices for the greater good. And it's a tariff, okay? These are policies that are a tariff and therefore help to reduce the usual domestic competitive issues that are at play when you think about domestic carbon regulation. And so the way I see it is, look, for the EU especially, conditional on having domestic carbon taxation, it is sort of a no-brainer politically to go ahead and stick in this CBAM policy. And therefore, for any country that has some kind of domestic carbon taxation in place, including China, putting in a CBAM policy, pairing that domestic regulation with a CBAM is something that just gives domestic benefits for free and therefore should be done. Even if China is at 10 euros per ton now, I'm not saying they have to go up to 90 euros per ton. All I'm saying is they should, on their 10 euros per ton, stick in a CBAM alongside the 10 euros per ton, adjusting up to 10 euros per ton. That's going to be advantageous for the Chinese government. And so I think as we think about navigating this very rich and complex political landscape, I do think that green trade policy, green tariffs like the CBAM are a policy that is viable in this setting.
There's also a potential policy where the United States institutes a CBAM but doesn't have a domestic carbon price, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
And so dynamically it's tricky because
Yes.
then if putting in the CBAM with then it's not even an adjustment, right? It's just a carbon tax without domestic carbon regulation. If doing that reduces pressure to pass domestic carbon regulation in the first place, okay, then that's not going to be better. But if we're in a world where there's no carbon taxation ever that is feasible in the US, but a green tariff is feasible, the green tariff can have an impact, including globally, as this paper argues, alongside other papers in this literature.
Yes. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you so much, Allan. This was really, really instructive. Thank you for your time. So I'm just going to say our next webinar is going to take place on November 11th with Shifra Arondine from Berkeley, who will present her paper, Rebuild or Relocate Recovery After Natural Disasters. Thank you so much, Allan, for a very interesting paper and discussion, and to our panelists and our participants who also participated. Thanks, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bari, for hosting.
Awesome. Very good. Thanks, Allan. I'll see you later. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll see you around. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.